Today we are joined with Professor Michael Huemer. He's a philosophy professor at Colorado University. He has written many articles and over a dozen books covering ethics, epistemology, and political philosophy, along others. So, Professor Huemer, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I just wanted to start by asking you about your background in philosophy. I'm just curious, like, how did you decide to go into philosophy? Is this something that you kind of learned when you were an undergraduate, or is there another interest that propelled you to enter philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I took a philosophy class in college at UC Berkeley, and it turned out to be the most interesting subject that they had. But they don't do this in high school, and it turns out that philosophy is more interesting than any other of the subjects that they do. Philosophy was the only subject in which you're allowed to discuss things that matter. Okay, so there are fields where you learn about things that matter, like physics, where you learn about our basic understanding of physical reality, but there's no discussion of it. They just tell you, here are the current theories. Just learn it. Just learn this. Learn to solve these equations. And then there are other classes where you have discussions, but you're never allowed to discuss anything that matters. So in your English class, you get to have discussions, but you can't talk about anything that matters. So like when you talk about a work of literature, you're allowed to talk about what the author was doing, but you're not allowed to talk about the actual themes, right? There would be great works of literature that are about some great philosophical question, but you're not allowed to address that question. You're only allowed to talk about the author's technique or something like that. That doesn't matter. Right, unless you're planning on becoming an author, which you're not. So, but anyway, yeah, and you get into a philosophy class and you get to talk about things like, can a computer be conscious? Do we have free will? Is there a beginning of time? And you just have debates about things like that.
That's interesting that you mentioned that, because I know for me, it's I just graduated from Bowling Green, but my interest in philosophy really started after I think it was my sophomore year. I first started at a community college and I took a philosophy class. I thought it was just way more interesting than any other subject. And I was originally interested in English because I was I like writing, I like reading, but I just thought philosophy was a better use of those interests more so than any other subject.
Why don't normal high schools offer philosophy courses? I'm assuming some do, but at least in my high schools that I went to growing up, but they never really offered that. Is there a reason for it?
It's sort of random. What happens is when you're a small child, you need to learn to read and write. And also you need to learn basic arithmetic. And you need those basic skills before you learn all the other things. Okay, and then the people who are designing our education system, my guess is they were just not very thoughtful. And so they're okay, so now that they've learned to read and write, what's next? And they're I don't know, more reading and writing, I guess, but just have them read literature, I guess, and then we'll just do that for the next 10 years, even though they already know how to read and write. And, the people designing the education system probably had not themselves studied philosophy and probably did not understand why it was important.
Before going into Progressive Myths, your most recent book, I thought maybe a discussion about rationality and critical thinking is probably most important because I know a lot of people get emotional when talking about political myths and things like that. And you kind of delve into this subject in the last chapter of the book, I believe, where you talk about the traits and behaviors and qualities that rational thinkers or reliable thinkers possess. And so what are some of these traits to look for, and how can an ordinary person maybe better develop those traits?
I was trying to think about, in one section I talk about sort of how you could tell if somebody's reliable. Most people, when they try to learn about the world outside of their own personal life and personal experience, they have to rely on experts. There are all these people putting out content that purports to be empirical facts about reality. They're not going to do too much work, So it is important to be able to identify who's reliable, right? I think about people like Scott Alexander of the whatever it's called, the Astral Codex 10 Substack, right? Oh yeah. Okay. So what are the characteristics of the reliable people? So like one of the things is um, they give non-question begging arguments for things. So like there are a bunch of people who are like ideologues. Like they give you arguments for things, but all of the arguments are ideological. Like they're all like referring to other elements of their ideology. They're supporting some claim that people on their side of the political spectrum believe, and then they're supporting with other claims that people on their side of the political spectrum believe, but people on the opposite side would not believe. So, right, they're sort of like, sort of question begging arguments. Reliable people will commonly qualify their claims. So they'll say, for the most part, such and such, or yeah, this is true on average, or something like that, rather than just making very blanket absolute statements. Or they would acknowledge when there's uncertainty, or sometimes they acknowledge when there are arguments against the claim. What else? You should acknowledge that if you're discussing a controversial position, you should generally acknowledge the arguments against it, like against your view. If you don't ever address the arguments against your view, then that may mean that you don't know about them, in which case you're an irresponsible thinker, because you should know. Or it may mean that you don't want your audience to know about them, which is also a bad sign, right? Or it may mean that you don't have anything to say about them, which is also a bad sign. So, okay. So yeah, addressing counter arguments, I guess. If you always agree with one of the standard political orientations, then you're probably biased. Because it's unlikely that one of the standard like clusters of political views, the whole cluster of left-wing views, it's like unlikely that that's generally correct. So if you can't think of any way in which the cluster of left-wing views is wrong, then it's probably that you're being influenced by this sort of like tribalism, where you feel like you have to agree with the other people in your tribe, rather than that that's actually correct. Right. And now, it's not that being emotional about politics is inappropriate. Like often there are important things at stake, and like so often there are reasons to be emotional. Like it's often justified, but nevertheless, that can still bias your judgments, right? And if you can't control your emotions for the purpose of having discussions with others, then you probably also can't control them for the purpose of thinking objectively for yourself. Reliable thinkers talk about the evidence, and in a specific way, right? Like they might give government statistics or something like that, right? Or, if you're talking about like a news case, like a case that went through the courts, or just, went through some official adjudication, right? Like the Kyle Rittenhouse case, right? There was a court trial. Somebody who's reliably commenting on that should be familiar with what happened. Like right. In that case, like they should be familiar with what happened in the trial. They should know, and they should be like, if they refer to the evidence that was presented at trial, that's good. If they don't refer to that at all, that's a bad sign. There are other things where there are official statistics, like if you're talking about something about the economy, like having the statistics from the Federal Reserve, because they have a lot of statistics on their website. If you know something about that, like that's a good sign. If you don't know anything about that, that's a bad sign. Okay. Anyway, so all right, these are all examples of what happens with reliable thinking. Oh, I do want to say this though, like, so I don't know if this belongs on the same list, but it's common for people to sort of like attack rationality. Like that happens sometimes in the academic intellectual world. They try to say things like, you can't really be objective and nobody can really be rational, or like whatever. And, logic is a tool of oppression or something like that. If somebody is doing that, super bad sign, right? Because what that means, or like, they don't want you to look at the evidence, right? And this is of a piece with the people who try to silence the people who disagree with them. Like, not that they're trying to rebut them, they're trying to silence them. Okay, so all of these things, like attacking rationality, saying that nobody can be objective, attacking science, or, trying to silence people who criticize you, all of that is a sign that you're wrong, right? Like that that an objective, rational examination of the evidence would go against the view that you're trying to put forward. Okay, like that's the best explanation for why somebody would be doing those things. So, okay, so if you see that, be wary.
Yeah, I think I think those are all great points. It kind of reminds me of, I just finished a book, The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef, and she talks a lot about like the some of the similar things that you mentioned. I know one that stuck out to me is like getting overly emotional about complex topics. I know one thing I try to do is if I'm reading a piece of media and I see if I get the sense that it's designed to make me super angry, then it gives me reason to pause and proceed with caution. Because then I think it's also important to be aware of the fact that like especially in social media, the main driver or incentive for social media companies to keep you engaged with them is attention. It's like that's kind of the goal, is to grab your attention. And exploiting people's emotion is like a huge way to really like lure someone in and to keep their attention.
Good point. Yeah, like, what is the product that media companies sell? And this is true of this social media as well as the traditional media, right? What is their product? Their product is not knowledge. Okay,
That's certainly true.
The product of a company or a person is that which they get paid for if they provide it. And they don't get paid more for providing more accurate information. Their product is attention, right? Their customer is not the viewer. Their customer is advertisers. And what the advertisers want is somebody to capture attention, to direct it to these companies that are selling their products, okay? Okay, so that's the product that they're selling. And so, and maybe sometimes providing accurate information can grab people's attention, but it's really common that you grab people's attention by, just like whatever, sensationalizing. And, and that could work whether the thing you're saying is true or not, but usually it's not. Like usually the most entertaining story is not the truth. Where the truth very rarely just happens to maximize entertainment value or attention grabbing value. And usually you can increase those things by departing from the facts.
I thought maybe the next section we could talk about is some of the social psychology myths in your book. You have a chapter where you discuss implicit bias and stereotype threat, I believe it is. So maybe just starting with implicit bias, like what is the idea of implicit bias and what might be some, I guess, issues with the research surrounding it or the concept of it?
Yeah. So the idea is that you have sort of unconscious biases. You have sort of like subconsciously you associate certain groups with certain characteristics, or you associate one concept with another concept. And the idea is that you can test the strength of somebody's associations by doing this reaction time experiment, okay? So the person is shown, this could be used to test associations between any two concepts, okay? But for example, they try to show whether people have positive or negative associations with a particular race. Okay, so like they will show you something on a screen that either pertains to Black people or white people or goodness or badness, okay? And then they tell you you're supposed to press one button if you see something that relates to either Black people or goodness, and a different button for things that relate to either white people or badness, okay? And then they time how quickly you can do this task. And then they reverse it, right? Or you could do this with different people, like associate white people with goodness and Black people with badness, okay? And then it turns out that it's easier for people to associate white people with goodness, like they perform the task quicker, okay? And then so that's supposed to show that they have an implicit bias against Black people in favor of white people, okay? And but you can test all sorts of associations. So it turns out that people associate women more with the home and family, and men more with work, okay? And, based on the same sort of reaction time experiment, okay? Incidentally, it also turns out, so the left-wing people like to quote the results that I just mentioned. They do not like to quote the following result, which is that people associate women with goodness and men with badness more easily. It's harder for them to associate men with goodness and women with badness, okay? But the left-wing people don't mention that particular result because it doesn't match their narrative, okay? So that's, I don't know, that's the idea of implicit bias. And then the people who talk about this will either imply or sometimes just state that this predicts actual discriminatory behavior. But in fact, there's virtually no evidence of that. like it's super hard in experimental setups to detect a connection between implicit bias and actual discriminatory behavior. Okay, so so we don't know if it predicts anything kind of important, right? Like there's a difference of 0.2 seconds in your reactions, and then so what? Like what? Maybe that indicates some unconscious degree of bias, but is it a bias that matters because it actually affects people's behavior? Okay, we don't know that. What else? Did that answer the question?
No, I think that's a good breakdown. Like, I remember taking the, I think it's called the implicit association test. I think that's the official name. I remember taking that. It's either my freshman or sophomore year of college, and it's not surprising to me that like at the time, like I looked at my results and they're pretty similar to, I guess, what the progressive narrative would say, right? Where like I grew up in a town that was like majority white, and so it's like when I saw that result, I wasn't too surprised that maybe I do have like an unconscious bias, but at the same time as well, like I was also taught like morals, good morals growing up. And I'm not sure if like the unconscious bias is always as strong as some people said, because, I feel like I internalize those morals. Like I think racism is very bad, but we should do everything we can to combat it when we see it. Yes. But sometimes I feel like people put too much weight on the unconscious bias. So I just worry that like, even if the results or the findings related to implicit bias are a little bit overstated, I worry that like maybe we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater when we just get rid of or just like discard the idea of implicit bias in its entirety. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah. Well, we don't want to say that there's no such thing as implicit bias, right? I guess we can't say that, but we also can't say that this is an important phenomenon or that this is an important cause of discriminatory behavior. And actually, one of the studies about this says that, they're trying to find the correlation between your IAT scores, implicit association test scores, and your discriminatory behavior, but actually they couldn't find any discriminatory behavior. Well, they did experiments and they found actually some people favor black people in like sort of behavior and some people favor white people, and overall it's a wash. Like neither race is particularly advantaged overall. So they couldn't find anything for the IAT to be explaining. The other thing that I want to mention, I just forgot to mention, was it's a really low reliability test. So you give this to the same person on different days and they get very different scores.
I see.
And so, if you give a test, there should be a strong correlation between your score on one day and your score on another day. Like I give a classroom of people an IQ test, and then I give the same classroom the same IQ test like the next week. Roughly speaking, the ordering of scores should be about the same. So people's scores might go up the second time because they're more familiar with it, but their ordering should be roughly the same, okay? And that doesn't happen with the IAT. And you can change your scores. Also, there are interventions that can change your IAT score. You could do some exercises to try to form a stronger association between black people and goodness, and then you change your IAT score. But there's no evidence that actually produces any tangible benefits, right?
Yeah, I do wonder, maybe because I took the test during a sociology course. I can't remember which one, but I know it was a sociology course. And sometimes I wonder, maybe if the content I read before taking the test had an impact on the results of the test. I guess in general, though, it seems like to me that the importance of implicit bias in regards to or subconscious bias in general is just dramatically overstated. And it doesn't mean, like you said, that we should go around denying we have subconscious biases. But, if I just think if you want to improve the conditions of people, especially minority people, if you're progressive, it's probably more productive to focus on other things like economic conditions of communities.
I want to hop in here because, as somebody who's very progressive, I do think there is, a little problem with like the identity politics, sort of thing. But I just feel like a lot of the time the right makes it more of an issue than it is. Like, I don't, do I get tired of all the noise on like social media and stuff? Absolutely. But, at least from the people that I'm around, in progressive groups and stuff, like I don't feel like they're quote unquote woke that much, at least from my experience.
Right. Well, if you were not so left wing, you would probably think they were very woke. Like, that's fine. You're like, no, this is fine.
I guess it could also be the case that like maybe like you might have a bias, Devin, if like you're progressive and you're with other progressives, but at the same time too, like the situation might be different outside of academia. Like I noticed, like as somebody who's like interested in going to graduate school and pursuing an academic career, like I feel like I get more annoyed by it than maybe like the average person.
That's fair.
I say that as like I consider myself more left leaning. I'm probably closer to like the moderate side of the political spectrum. But like I guess the things that like I notice might not be things that I guess people outside of academia might notice. But we'll go on to discuss stereotype threat next. It seems that the research or the consensus surrounding stereotype threat to me is more controversial than the consensus surrounding implicit bias. That there seems to be more issues with how people interpret the studies behind stereotype threat. So I'll just give you the floor, Huemer. What is like stereotype threat? What's the consensus about it? And where does the research go wrong in the concept?
Yeah, so it's the idea that if people are reminded of, so like stereotypes about your group can influence your performance such that it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, like you perform according to stereotypes. All right, so it's said that if you remind Black people of their race before they take an academic test, then they will perform worse on that test. Or if you remind women of their sex. So like, somebody's taking a math test and then they're asked to write their gender at the top of the test as opposed to at the bottom of the test or something like that. Then the women will perform worse when they have to identify their gender before they do the test because there's a stereotype about women being bad at math. Okay. So that's what's said. And there are a whole bunch of studies that have results like that. There are a bunch of people who will report the results so that it sounds like they're saying that the entire test score gap is explained by stereotype threat. And that is absolutely not the case, right? It might be, it's at most a very small portion of the gap. Okay, so there's like a gap between Black and white scores on standardized tests like the SAT or IQ tests, and it's roughly one standard deviation, which is big. And the reason why people thought that it might be explaining the entire gap was basically just a misunderstanding of a graph that appears in the original paper on this. There's a graph in the original paper where it shows Black and white scores in the low stereotype threat condition and in the high stereotype threat condition. Like, so the high threat condition is where they were reminded of their race or whatever, and the low threat condition where they weren't. Okay. And the graph appears to show the Blacks and whites performing the same in the low threat condition. However, if you read the text, those scores were actually adjusted for the person's, they were controlled for the person's initial SAT score. Okay. So what it actually means is not that the Blacks and whites were performing equally in absolute terms in the low threat condition, but rather they were performing the same relative to their SAT scores. Right? So like in the low threat condition, the Blacks were performing, they were underperforming the whites by the same amount that they underperformed on their SAT scores. Okay. So, which is about one standard deviation. Okay. But there's a bunch of weird things about the stereotype threat literature. Okay. But maybe the most important thing is there are different kinds of experiments that will, they'll have different conditions that are more or less realistic for actual testing conditions. And the more realistic you make it, the less effect you can find. And then there are a couple of studies that used actual administrations of standardized tests, right? Like the ACT test or something like this, or the computerized placement tests, which are used for placing people in classes in community colleges. Okay, so actual standardized tests, and then they couldn't find the stereotype threat effect, right? And so what that suggests is that, okay, well, this is actually not explaining any of the gap in actual standardized test scores.
Got it. Yeah. And it seems like the misunderstanding of the research you discuss is, I guess, like what spawned like the consensus about it. And I guess this is like all this stuff is part of like the broader replication crisis in the social sciences that you talk about. So maybe if you could describe to the audience, like what is the replication crisis in the social sciences? And continue.
This happened in social science and to some extent in medicine also, that there were a bunch of published research results that appear to be false. Let's say there are published research results, social science and psychology, where if somebody attempts to replicate the study, they don't get the same result. This has happened. That's actually the majority of the time. The majority of the time, you'll not get the same result. Or if you do get the same result, it'll be a smaller magnitude, like significantly smaller. And it's really quite striking. There are even cases where there's some effect that had been found over and over again. Like there are many studies. So there's like the ego depletion effect, which is the effect that supposedly if you do something that requires willpower, that saps your willpower. And then if you have another task that requires willpower, you're worse at doing that. So so willpower gets depleted or something like that. Okay. And that has been found many times. There are many studies over the years that found them. But then recently they tried to do these very large multi-lab studies and they couldn't find the effect. It appeared to have vanished. And you're like, what's going on? So like even when a thing has been replicated, you can't be sure that it's true, right? Okay, what's going on? Well, there's a bunch of stuff going wrong in this type of statistical science. Okay, so one thing is publication bias, which is that it's harder to publish something if you find a null effect. So you try to find a causal effect between two variables, and if you don't find the effect, then it's hard to get it published. And if you do find the effect, then you do get it published. So if 20 labs do a study and one of them finds an effect, that one publishes. And that maybe the 19 who didn't get an effect maybe can't get it published. Okay, and then you have things like the researchers just sort of like try to game the system. Okay, so they'll try to manipulate things in order to get the effect, or they'll sort of they'll look at multiple different variables and just run correlations on multiple different pairs of variables until they find one where the correlation is strong enough to pass a statistical significance test. Frequently in psychology, the level of significance required to say that you got a significant result is 5%. And what that means is like literally what it means is that if there's no effect whatsoever, there's still a 5% chance that you will find one. Right? That's what the 5% significance level means. So that means that if you have all false hypotheses, 1 in 20 of them will pass the test. and then we'll get published. And then, okay. And then, so like if you have multiple different variables, like if you have 20 different pairs of variables, or like 20 different ways of testing the data, then one of them will probably pass the test. Right? And, there are a lot of decision points when you're doing one of these studies. So like it's not unrealistic that you could find 20 ways of looking at the data. So, okay, that's part of what happens. A lot of these studies were just, incidentally other things, like a lot of studies in psychology have been small, like whatever, 20 people or something like that, because it costs money to do the study. A lot of the times when somebody sort of does a replication of a study, it's not an exact replication. It's a, quote, conceptual replication, which means that they try to test the same effect, but in a different way, rather than redoing exactly the same thing the original team did. And the reason why you should, like, superficially, that makes sense. We're gathering more evidence. We already know the result of this exact way of doing the test. What if we do it a different way? Okay, but actually, no, we don't know. Because one team got this result one time does not mean that that's actually true. Like, you need to redo the exact same thing and make sure that it's real. So anyway, okay. And then, and with the conceptual replications, there are like many different ways of doing that. You have an effect like ego depletion. There are many different ways that you can come up with that might be manifested, right? Like, human psychology is weird and complicated in that way. That if you posit some human psychological mechanism, there can be many different conceivable manifestations that you can try to test. And then you can just try to test all of these until you find one that works.
Yeah, and it seems like a big issue that sort of, causes the problem to appear again and again is like the pressure to publish or perish that people talk about. There's such I think an incentive for people to produce something that looks significant or find a finding that on its surface like seems groundbreaking or like significant in its own way. And I just don't know, like, what do we do about that? Because I don't think the pressure to publish is going to go away. I mean, this is kind of like how people advance in the academic career. So like,
actually, that kind of like brings up a related problem, which is there's kind of a selection effect, right? So people who are good at getting results will get tenure and they will get more money. They will have an easier time getting grants, so they'll get more money and do more studies, and so those people will keep publishing more. And the people who are not getting good at getting results, maybe because they're honest, right? Or maybe maybe because the hypotheses are actually false and they're testing them correctly and they're getting the no results. Those people are likely to not get tenure and they're likely to get kicked out of the academic profession, right? So okay. I also wanted to mention, like, this is interesting. Like, one of the things that started the replication crisis was this psychologist, Daryl Bem, who, I forget when this was, but, he published a paper allegedly finding evidence of ESP. All right. And like, he had multiple studies where, he passed the statistical significance test, like P less than 0.05, where, allegedly, it showed that people have precognition, and if you look at the p-values for these multiple studies that he reported, it was like allegedly really super low probability that this happened due to chance. Okay, but when people saw this, they were like, "Wait, I don't think there's precognition." Like, right, and involved, his hypothesis was there's backwards causation, like the future is affecting people now so that they can see what's going to happen in the future. And like, that's super unlikely that that's true. Okay, so then you should start to think maybe there's something wrong with the methodology that people are using in psychology, right? If you can prove that there's precognition with like super high significance, right? So anyway, okay, yeah. Anyway, you had asked something about like what could be done about it. And there are ideas that people have. There's like, journals should publish more replication studies, and they should commit to publishing a study whether or not. So like, people can pre-register a study, and then like which means you say before you report the results of the study, you say what you're going to do, right? And that prevents you from fudging things and changing what your hypothesis is to match the evidence. Okay, but also, an idea that people have is, well, journals should pre-commit to publishing a study based upon the description of the study before they know the results. And so that way, if it gets a null result and, finds no effect, then they still publish it. So then the scientific community can know that that thing didn't work.
Got it. I guess we'll move on to discuss economic myths real quick. I think this is like the part of the book where like as a liberal, I started to like reconsider some thoughts, but also like I started to like maybe to like object to parts of your arguments here. So I'll just begin by talking about licensing and regulations. And I'm sure, Devin, you have some things to talk about regulations, so I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just about licensing, I think you make a really good point that there are many cases where licensing laws hurt people, right? So the one example that comes to mind is like maybe in like accounting and finance, for instance. There's probably people who could do really good work in those fields, but don't have the licenses or maybe like the education requirements to pursue those licenses. And licensing laws probably, or like I would say, do shut them out of competing in that career. And I think this is harmful, like both economically and to consumers. But then there's other cases where, like maybe in certain situations, those kinds of laws are justified. So I think about I don't know, like it's probably good in my view to regulate air traffic to some degree or construction to some degree. And so like, I guess maybe it's like, to me, I just think I'm sure you would agree, like all this stuff is nuanced, but like I would probably be more favorable to regulation in some respects. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, good. So the air traffic control example is interesting and different from most cases. Partly because I think the air traffic controllers are just government employees to begin with. So, but also because there's there's externalities. I mean, the main thing is externalities, right? Like if you do a bad job at air traffic control, it threatens other people besides your customer. Okay, but with most services, it's just the customer whose interest is at stake. And so then usually the market works pretty well. Now, people think, okay, so I give examples like, oh, hairdressers need licenses in many places, right? Like, that's stupid. And like a lot of people will agree with that because they think, well, it's not that important. Like, so if you have a bad hairdresser, like big deal. But most people think, oh, well, you need licensing for doctors because it's a really big deal if the doctor gets things wrong. Okay, but the thing is, like, the evidence doesn't generally show that licensing improves quality overall. Like, so there have been a bunch of studies of this, and you're like, oh, well, why wouldn't it improve quality? How could that be? Licensing does remove some incompetent people, right? Like really dumb people will not be able to pass the tests or whatever. However, it also reduces competition. So for the people who do pass the test and, they're in there and they're to some degree protected from competition. Like the supply of competitors is restricted, which means there's like a chronic shortage. And if there's a chronic shortage, then people can get away with like providing lower quality than they otherwise could. Right. And so like it's not clear that the quality will increase overall, and like economic studies don't in general show an increase in quality. Like sometimes there's an increase in quality, sometimes there's a decrease in quality, and there's not an overall obvious trend.
It kind of reminds me, I could be wrong on this, but I do believe that Ohio is one state that has reduced their requirements for accounting licenses, and I wonder if like that's one reason is that maybe they've been restricted to such a degree that they've produced a shortage of people providing those services. I don't know if you have anything.
I have a great example of this. Okay, so obviously cannabis was legalized in Ohio. I forget what year. It was probably 2022 or 2023. I can't.
It's one of those years.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, the amount of regulations that we have in this state for cannabis is absurd. I mean, the license that you have to get is upwards of like $50,000 to $100,000. And when you're looking at, young entrepreneurs and, small business, you really want to support small business. The Republicans have pretty much made it impossible for, the young person or like, the small timer to, go in and start a business in that area. So, and that's why I have a lot of issues with, some things on the right. They stand for, less government, deregulation, and here we are with cannabis.
Well, yeah. So what's going on? Okay, so like licensing restricts supply and increases prices. So then you get this sort of unholy alliance between the existing cannabis sellers and like religious people or whatever people who think that drugs are evil. Okay, they both want the supply restricted. One group wants the supply restricted to raise the prices because they already have the license. So, and then the other group wants, they just want there to be fewer people using cannabis. Okay. Regulations like this, like it's very common that regulations hit small businesses harder than big businesses, right? Because whatever, say it's $100,000. Well, like if you're a big business and you do like 10 million in sales every year, that's no big deal. But if you're a small business and you do $1 million in sales or whatever, it's just not worth it, right? Like that's going to eat up your profit margin. So it excludes the small businesses and then makes things easier for the big businesses. And the big businesses, coincidentally, are also the ones who can afford to hire lobbyists to lobby the government.
Yeah.
And like that's the way regulation frequently works, right? By the way, like regulations frequently, they impose some kind of fixed cost, right? Where like it's independent or like, at least not proportional to the size of the business. which means it's easier for big business to handle that cost than a small business.
I want to ask you what your solution is to the rising rental prices going on in these complexes. Obviously, as a renter myself, I've had to move out of apartments because my rent got jacked up, $200-$300, and I don't make a whole lot of money, especially coming from Ohio. So, if you could talk about a little bit about rent control and what your ideas are with that.
I mean, price controls in general don't work. And if you talk to virtually any economist, including left-wing economists, they're gonna be like, no, price control, wrong idea for whatever your problem is. Okay, now, fundamentally, what you have to understand is if it seems like there are super high prices and it's really annoying, the problem isn't the prices, the problem isn't the greed of the seller, whatever. The problem is supply and demand. The problem is that there's a shortage relative to the demand. That just has to be, I don't know the details of the situation, but that just has to be what it is. So if it seems like the demand is, if it seems like, they're providing more supply, but some other prices are going up anyway, it's got to be that the demand is going up faster than the supply or something like that. And rent control or price controls where you limit the price, it has to be below a certain amount, that exacerbates the fundamental problem. Right, because that reduces the incentive to supply the thing. Right, if you reduce the reward for the people who are supplying the thing, that's going to exacerbate the shortage. And so then it will be that people the price will be lower, by law, so then people can afford it, but they won't be able to get it because there isn't enough. Right. So this is a thing that will happen in heavily rent-controlled cities. You could afford the rent, but you can't get an apartment because there's a 2-year waiting list or something. Or, back when I was in Berkeley, there was an apartment that came open, which was right next to campus. And then I go there and there's dozens of people who are all applying for this same apartment.
Oh, yeah. I've seen those lines. It's crazy. Yeah.
I'm yeah, well, I could afford this, but there's no way I'm getting it. They would have these super high requirements for you to get the apartment. So they can't raise the rent, but they can make really demanding other requirements. So anyway, now if you believe in wealth redistribution and you're not a libertarian, you're a leftist, and you think that housing is more important than other goods, to make this rational, you have to think that in some way that sort of housing is undervalued by the market or whatever. Okay, but anyway, so if you think that, the more rational thing to do is to offer to subsidize people's housing, right? So for low-income people, maybe give them a subsidy where the government could pay part of their rent. And so what that does is, it will enable them to better afford it, but also it will increase the incentive to provide the housing. You see what I mean?
Sure. And I think a big conversation I've seen people talk about is deregulating aspects of you did the housing industry or construction industry, whatever you want to call it. I know there's a lot of restrictions on how apartments or homes need to be built, especially in suburbs and suburban areas. And I think it makes it more of a headache for developers to build housing that might, be best for consumers. I still get concerned though. Sometimes I worry, if you would remove regulation entirely in that industry, I don't know. What if you have a really terrible builder and somebody moves in or something and some disaster happens and they're hurt really severely. I guess I will put the builder out of business, or they would take a hit for sure. But I just don't know if I don't know if that's a preferable alternative to some form of regulation to make sure buildings are safe. So
yeah, I mean, so there is without regulation, there is a solution to low quality products, which is lawsuits. So they you're already liable if whatever you fucked up and it caused harm to somebody. Is that adequate? I mean, theoretically, it produces the right incentive, right? Because you're on the hook for the amount of damage that you're going to cause. And then you also get the benefit from whatever saving money. So you have an incentive to weigh the cost savings against the risk and whatever, and only do it if it's worth it. But by the way, this reminded me, so I've heard I don't know any details on this, right? But I've heard like, okay, somebody suggested that a good way to provide low-income housing would be to have a building where there's like a common kitchen on a floor, common kitchen and common bathroom on a floor, and then there are separate bedrooms for multiple different people who use the same kitchen bathroom. That would like save a bunch of money. And then I heard that it was in fact illegal to provide that kind of housing. I don't know any details about this, right? But I think like whatever the regulations just prevent you from doing that. And it's just like, okay, why are there irrational regulations like that? Because it serves somebody's interest. Like somebody who already has money and influence. Like maybe large company. There's a large company that owns apartment buildings, and they don't want competition from some upstart who's going to start a new way of making a building that's going to be more attractive to more customers. So they are going to try to get regulations made that prevent this potential competition.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a very complicated situation. I mean, sometimes like I wonder too if like my hesitancy to remove regulations could be like an artifact of status quo bias. But I mean, generally though, like I do still feel like intuitively a little hesitant to do that. I think I guess that transitions to one of our final topics. You know, you wrote a book called Progressive Myths, and I think some of our viewers might see that and be like, "Oh, this guy's a political hack." It's just not the case. You provide like reason arguments for your position, but you're also very critical of Trump, and that might surprise some people because you know, like you wrote a book called Progressive Myths, and yet you're very critical of like the sort of like the opposition and in some people's perspective to the current administration. So like, what is your main like critique of Donald Trump, and what are the things that like make you most worry about the current administration?
Yeah, good question. See, I like to say that what I don't like about the progressives and what I don't like about Trump is the same thing. I'm against both of them for the same reason, which is that I don't want to burn our society to the ground. Like, I value what America has. Like, I value, you know, we have democracy, we have relative freedom. It's like, okay, like there are a lot of problems in our society, but if you compare it to the vast majority of societies throughout human history, we're doing great. If you compare it to the ideal that you can imagine, then, you know, we're doing poorly, okay? But usually if you disrupt things, what will happen is that you move back towards the average, not that you move to something even better. Like if you disrupt things in a semi-random way or without like a very specific plan for how you're going to reform things, if you just start changing things around or like disrupting the institutions, you're going to make the society revert to the way most societies have been, not make it become perfect, right? And the way most societies have been is way worse, okay? So like the problem with Trump, to me, the worst problem with Trump was undermining norms. And like the biggest example of this was the fake elector scheme, which for some reason got hardly any press. This is like the worst thing that any president has ever done. It got hardly any press. Okay, the January 6th got a huge amount of press, but that was just a small part of an overall scheme to steal the election. Like, okay, and then like, you know, you have these Republicans saying, oh, but Hillary Clinton didn't just concede the election either. Like, okay, but okay, yeah, she did make incautious remarks, okay, but she did not literally try to take office when she lost. She did not have a serious concerted plan going for months, like with a credible plan to actually assume office without having won the election. And Trump had an actual serious plan. Like he convened slates of fake electors to make fake election certificates to pretend that he had won states that he lost. And then he had those certificates sent to Washington and tried to get Mike Pence to count the fake votes so that he could remain in office. And if that had happened, what would be the next thing? And, you know, remember, like you're in this session of Congress and like Mike Pence is just declaring Trump to have won these states that everyone in the room knows that he lost. So what happens next? This would have been like, this is like Civil War time.
I said that last night when we were chatting. Yeah, it's scary, man.
It is shocking to me how like nobody really talked about the fake electors scheme or plot, especially relative to January 6th. I remember reading about it. I think it was sort of around of the time where Biden debated Trump, and I was going through like and doing some research about like what actually happened behind the scenes, and so legitimately it was kind of like it gave me goosebumps. I was like, this is insane. And for some reason, people just didn't talk about it. And I guess maybe that's like an example where accuracy or truth doesn't always sell. Like the thing that will sell and give people's attention in media is like scenes of violence on the Capitol. But I mean, really, if you compare what happened on January 6th to the fake electors plot, to me, it's like it's just so much worse with the fake electors plot.
Like the January 6th riot, like by itself, it's just a riot. But the reason why it was significant was that it was supporting the fake electors scheme, right? That it was an attempt to intimidate Mike Pence into doing Trump's bidding,
Right.
which if he had done, then would have potentially precipitated a civil war.
Yeah, I guess one final point, I'll give you the last word after I ask this, is you talk a lot about how like progressives want to burn America to the ground, but like I talk to progressives. I have a lot of friends who are progressives. I'm a liberal, and like my perception to me is like people just want to improve society. I don't deny that there are people that hate America, but at the end of the day, like most progressives will tell me like, I want to improve America. Like I'm fighting because I want to see a more idealized America. I'll give you like a chance to quickly respond to that, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, good. I mean, like, I don't have statistics on how many people hate America versus merely want to improve America. Of course, like, I wouldn't expect people to say outright, I hate America. Like, there's a social desirability bias, or they're going to say that they're trying to improve it. Okay, and then you have things like, okay, you have people who are complaining about the sexism in America. So this is like a common thing for feminists, complaining about all the sexism and patriarchy in America, but they have nothing bad to say about Islam, which is like 1,000,000 times more patriarchal than America. Okay, so then like why are they allied with the Muslims? So if your priority is helping women, then you should be allied with America against the Islamic theocracies or whatever. But if your priority is hating America, then you'd be allied with the Muslims. And there are a bunch of progressives who think that the Muslims are their allies. So like this is the way that it looks. Right. And, whatever, I could give you examples like back at the University of Colorado, this was like, okay, this is a long time ago, but this was like shortly after 9/11, one of our professors in ethnic studies wrote this article, after the 9/11 attack, talking about how it was chickens coming home to roost. And then it just sounded like he was happy about the attack. It just sounded like, he thought that the people in the Twin Towers were just like legitimate targets, just, because they were capitalists or whatever. And it's like, if you're against America's war making in the world, good, like just like campaign against war, but like don't be talking about how terrorism is good. Anyway,
I think your book was very thought provoking. It definitely made me reconsider some of the progressive beliefs I've had. I don't agree with everything in it, but ultimately, I think the best thing about philosophy is it encourages critical thinking and it allows us to reconsider our own beliefs, and I think that's especially vital in a environment where it seems like that's all under attack. So I just want to appreciate your time, your respect to work you do, and thanks for talking today.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Oh, yep. Thanks for talking to me, and it's been great. Been great talking with you.